third paper for today, Conceptions of Design Methods, and Colin is going to present this.
Thank you for sticking around. This paper, I'm currently at Purdue University. This paper was, data was collected when I was at Indiana University working with Eric and others. So I do want to acknowledge, even though they're not on the author list, some of the people that helped me in producing some of this work. So today I'm going to focus on user experience practice and looking specifically at design methods as one angle into that space. So in the CHI community, we've had a history, at least in the last decade or so, of studying UX design practice on its own terms and really understanding what is happening with people on the ground. So work by Elizabeth Goodman, Ron Wakari, Eric, and others. One of the angles that has starting to take hold in terms of talking about this practice is the nature of design methods. And so this is drawing not only on old work from John Chris Jones from 1970, but also a more recent resurgence of interest in design methods and the codification of those methods. But what we're seeing in this process is a general lack of focus on praxis. There are some examples of people engaging with this space, but there's a lot of work that's left to be done here that we're building on in this paper. So the contributions of this paper are twofold, and I want to sort of situate this up front. So first, we're providing an account of how practitioners use methods in their everyday practice, including the methods that they would say are an essential part of their process, and also contextualizing the method use of practitioners within specific UX practice domains, and exploring the ways that they make situated judgments when they select and use methods. So ideally, these contributions shift our focus away from a formalized, objective description of methods that can often be common in HCI literature, especially at CHI, and curated collections of methods like the Hannington, Martin, and others, towards a more adaptive, appropriated use of methods in the wild. So this is the general structure for the talk. First, I'll situate design methods within HCI research and UX practice, which I've already started a little bit. Then share some details of the interview study that we conducted. Then I will talk more specifically about two different strands. First, the methods that are used by practitioners, and then also the methods that practitioners desire of people entering the profession. And then I'll wrap it all up to sort of talk in more depth about appropriation and recontextualization of those methods in practice. So John Chris Jones is seen as an early touchstone for the design methods movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And this later edition of the book that was originally released in 1970 provides an early account of the range of methods that designers use and how these methods can be seen to support creative production. What we've seen, though, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, is a resurgence of interest in design methods, probably in parallel with the design thinking movement popularized by the Stanford D School and IDEO and others, to this codification of methods. So moving beyond sort of this abstract depiction of the method space to reference books that follow this very typical format, a description of the method, relevant sources, and recommendations for application within the larger design process. Jones' original goal was to break open what he referred to as the black box of design. And the goal was to understand all the stuff that was happening in this complex performance that we know as designing and make it a glass box so that it could be open to description and evaluation. And this goal of transparent access to design cognition was, I think, started out on very good terms, but was quickly discarded when they realized that it was actually much more difficult than that, and they weren't going to be able to fully understand the cognitive and affective and cognitive processes that are involved in designing. So instead of doing that, this sort of opened up Riddle's second generation of design methods that focused primarily on argumentation and negotiation that's inherent in design activity. So our modern conception of design methods that those books on the previous slide draw on are a mechanism by which designers orchestrate and negotiate their own design activity, including the intentional selection and organization of information that leads to design insights and decisions. So this is the designer as, to use Jones' words, a self-organizing system. Within this space, we can view design activity in a lot of different respects. And I'm drawing on some previous work here presented at DIS in 2014. When you look at a design activity, you can take on different perspectives depending on what your primary areas of interest are. So if we look at a complex design performance, if you look at it from an academic perspective, say somebody performing something like contextual inquiry. As an academic, we could say, okay, well, here are the general steps of doing contextual inquiry as they're set out in several texts. And the way that it was actually done is a little bit less rigorous than what was originally prescribed. That's you could take that academic perspective. You could also take a practice perspective and look at that same activity and say, it is much more complex than just a list of steps. And in fact, the authentic practice is much richer than the original prescriptive method. And so there's a reduced complexity so we can communicate things more easily. Instead of talking about all the tacit knowledge and various steps that go into something, you can call it a simple term that will have some meaning to other people. So within this space, there has been a fair amount of work done over the last decade or so, looking at how we can characterize what's happening in terms of design methods in that design activity. So Woolrick et al. Have done work to understand that methods aren't really what he calls recipes. These aren't prescriptions that take us from step A to Z. They're really more ingredients. And in the process of dealing with those ingredients, much like a chef, we produce meals, but meals are not a sum total of their recipe. And so it's sort of upending what we understand about the prescriptive nature of design methods and placing the focus back on the appropriation and use. Stolterman and colleagues have also done a decent amount of work in this space with their tools and use framework and designerly tools. Designerly tools are almost an exact proxy for what we discuss as design methods in this paper. Basically, they're any tools that allow you to get work done and execute on your vision. I've also done some work on this space, specifically looking at how user experience designers conceive of and develop their competence over time, both in a formal educational capacity and also once they get down to practice. So a little bit about the study that we did. As I mentioned, there were several people involved in the data collection process. We started out with a stratified sample. So we were looking at representing a pretty wide swath of user experience practice. And in order to do that, we identified several characteristic types of practice and then used those to structure a sample. We then did interviews over Skype or in person, about an hour in length, with notes and then incomplete transcriptions of certain portions of the interviews. And then finally, I conducted a thematic analysis to understand what some of the themes that we're developing specifically around the methods that they used or expected practitioners to know how to use. So I don't expect you to be able to read this. It is in the paper. But the color bars show you the clustering of those strata that were mentioned in the last slide. And so we had 4 primary practice contexts that we were addressing: consultancies, client-facing agencies, large companies, and small companies. And there's a little bit more detail in the paper on exactly what each of those constituted. So we have an N of 13 practitioners and a pretty wide range of experience, educational background, et cetera. Most of them identified directly as UX designers or user experience designers in some form of their job title, although there are some other instances there as well, especially on the consulting side. We didn't want to constrain what these participants might feel is a legitimate method. So we didn't want them to just repeat the things out of their 100 Universal Methods of Design book or something. So we gave them actually quite a large definition of what we meant by design methods. And we read this verbatim at the beginning of each interview. And so you can see here that this was an intentionally inclusive framing of design methods, talking about everything from everyday methods, techniques, and tools to whiteboard, pen and paper, to formal axiomatic and algorithmic methods. So we're trying to cover a lot of ground to really talk about the nature of design methods as a tool and not necessarily as a specific codified thing that's in a book somewhere. We asked these practitioners a number of questions about their background, their use of experience, the ways that they work within teams in their organization. And then we drilled down a little bit more deeply to understand the ways that they use methods, looking at what are the methods they use on an everyday basis, what are some company practices, and is there any adaptation or codification of methods within their company that has shaped the way that they do their work? And then finally, we asked them if they were hiring a junior designer within their firm, what methods would that junior designer need to know? So I'll breeze through the findings pretty quickly, and they're going to be split right down the middle by those two characteristics. So on the left, we have the methods that the existing practitioners said that they used. On the right, you have the methods that they thought new practitioners should know how to use. In the paper, these are in these complicated charts. And in fact, they're very difficult to read, and in producing this presentation, I realized that there was probably a better way to show this information. So you'll get some information here in the slide deck that isn't in the paper. These are the 5 categories or themes that came out of the emergent thematic analysis. And so these are general clusters of themes that we saw across both of these questions that we asked the practitioners. And I'll go through each one of them in a relatively surface level of detail because of time. So for approach, this is really essentially the mindset that you take into a situation. On the methods that the practitioners used, this was more a proxy for what are the structures within their organization. So you see stuff like agile and strategic design. When we asked them about practitioners, though, they were talking about these much more affective and conative processes. So confidence, empathy, that kind of thing. And there was some interesting sort of setup to this on the part of the participants. There was this attitude that there were structures within the organization, but there's also a motivation of the designer to work against those in certain cases when they need to. When dealing with methods that are desired, though, Bruno says here that the ability to empathize with your coworkers, that's actually one of the most important skills, talking and really listening to what people have to say. So for communication, this is essentially dealing with face-to-face communication or technologically mediated communication. And the one in the middle is shared on both sides between both questions. And so somebody being articulate seemed to be really important. And then for newer employees, things like business skills were more important. Once they were on the ground, persuasion was actually how they got work done. And Diane exemplifies that persuasion element here. Talking about, when some business unit comes in and asks for advice, one of the things they have to do is sort of align what can we do for them and what problem are we trying to solve in the first place. So this quote describes some whiteboarding as a method to actually drill in on a problem frame that was appropriate. So for analysis, this is going to look the most like what you would typically think of as design methods, and we saw a lot of them here. But it's sort of interesting to see how few methods were prescribed for incoming practitioners. Broad knowledge was much more important from several of our participants than a lot of the typical ones that you might expect. And in fact, Hugh talks about this, about being a generalist and the value of being a generalist, at least in his work context. Understanding lots of different kinds of things and understanding how they fit together. So in user research, this was the smallest group by far in terms of responses. And the participants were much more interested in moving beyond the core skill of doing that thing to why you do it and the process of doing it. So here Bruno talks about you have to be able to interview people. That's just basic. When you move on from research, though, what are you going to do? Tell me how you come up with your personas, not only the end result, but how you got there. So representation is the final category, and representation really goes in parallel with communication. And so this is the documentation or the physical or digital artifacts that you leave behind or work through to create a final solution for the client. And sketching was shared across both of these, and sketching and whiteboarding seem to be quite important to participants in terms of everyday communication of their work within their organizational environments. And Hugh talks about this sketching as a core skill of prototyping to shift the way of thinking from deliverables in the final project to lots of process steps along the way. So I'll move on to the discussion quickly. One of the participants, Prakash, exemplifies a theme that ran through the participant responses, explaining that competence in UX practice is less about the methods themselves and more about how the designer thinks about the methods as tools to answer the right questions. So this is a form of instrumental judgment, which emphasizes not only a mechanical understanding of the method, but also the knowledge of when it's appropriate to be used, in what way, and how you know when you receive something of value out of that process. And you can see this is where the title of the paper comes from. It's more of a mindset than a method. I think a lot of that mindset is trying to do the right thing for the user and business, so you adapt your method based off of that. So it's just about knowing when to use what method. And the methods themselves you can probably describe in a page, but when it gets to actually getting the right value out of them, it's having that right mindset. What are the right questions we need to ask? Some participants even described one method that framed their entire approach to practice, with codified methods being combined and repurposed in this broader method. And so this mindset of use and the accompanying set of instrumental knowledge indicates this heightened role of adaptation and appropriation of methods. These designers are moving beyond a holistic use of off-the-shelf methods and treating the use of methods as an ad hoc bricolage rather than a performance of a codified set of steps. What we saw with a number of our participants was a very pragmatic approach to adaptation and use, where they, within their design activity, talked more about their methods as cores. And these cores became so abstracted that the link with the originating method was often lost, with little ability to recall or list methods in a mechanical way. And a lot of these methods arose through descriptions of project work rather than when we asked them to list methods themselves. So the combining of existing methods illustrates that formal barriers between the originating methods were left almost non-existent and often inaccessible to the designer responsible for creating the method in use. That's why perhaps that Ganesh concluded that his desire for starting UX practitioners was more skill than method. Not that the methods themselves were useless knowledge, but rather that the pragmatic center for their method is the flexible performance in a situated design context, not the method objectively defined itself. So future work, I think, expands in two directions. One is building on the history of research and scholarship on praxis and HCI, understanding more deeply, building on Elizabeth Goodman's work and others on the documentation of method use in situ, and also working with the larger design community to continue theorizing about what is the nature of design practice and how is it learned and executed. The other important area here, I think, is educating HCI practitioners, though. We have a history in a lot of educational settings of teaching the methods and then hoping that that mechanical understanding translates to that appropriation quality that I talked about earlier. However, I think there are better ways to scaffold some of this indeterminacy that comes with method use. So how can we think about building that instrumental judgment a little bit more explicitly in the education process? And what is the role of those softer competencies? So how can you build empathy, collaboration, some of those other things in so that understanding this appropriation becomes very much a part of how you go about your life as a practitioner? I'd like to thank the lab that this work came out of, the National Science Foundation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, do we have time for one or two questions?
Hi, Dan Buzzo from the University of the West of England. My background is in arts design, in industry and in education, in interaction design, and I'm involved in education. My feeling is that design is far more generative, and that's the value that it brings to HCI research, but a lot of what you're pointing towards makes a view of it as very convergent rather than divergent, that these are discrete things that you can put in place towards a sort of rationalist solution. Is that how you see the use for your situation?
So I think in this project we were specifically trying to demystify and expand on what happens in HCI practice. We know, I think, as designers that methods have this generative quality to them, and so we were trying to expand on